What if I told you that faith combined with wealth creation is God's original design for believers, but churches deliberately teach the opposite because wealthy congregants threaten their control and financial dependency schemes? For over 1,600 years, religious institutions have twisted biblical teaching to create artificial separation between spiritual faith and material prosperity, convincing millions that wanting money makes them less holy. Napoleon Hill studied 500 millionaires and discovered that the most successful people combined unwavering faith with systematic wealth-building strategies, exactly what God intended when He created humans in His image as creators and multipliers. The shocking truth is that faith without wealth limits your ability to fulfill divine purpose, while wealth without faith creates spiritual emptiness, but faith plus wealth creates unstoppable force for kingdom impact that churches fear more than anything else. Religious leaders suppress this divine equation because believers who understand their God-given right to both spiritual power and material abundance become independent thinkers who don't need institutional guidance or support. Today I'm exposing the divine plan that makes faith and wealth complementary forces rather than competing priorities, proving that God designed you to be both spiritually powerful and financially prosperous. If you've been made to feel guilty about wanting both spiritual growth and financial success, comment divine plan and share which religious teaching has limited your wealth building most. Hebrews 11:6 establishes the faith-wealth connection that churches desperately hide. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. The Greek word misthopodos means rewarder and includes material blessings for faithful service, not just spiritual benefits. God promises to reward earnest seekers with tangible benefits that enhance their ability to serve His purposes more effectively. This verse destroys the false teaching that spiritual people should expect only heavenly rewards while suffering financially on earth. Napoleon Hill found that successful people maintained absolute faith in positive outcomes while taking systematic action toward their goals, exactly what this passage describes. The phrase, "earnestly seek Him," indicates persistent effort combined with unwavering faith, while rewards indicates measurable returns for faithful investment of time, energy, and resources. Churches avoid teaching this because they want believers dependent on institutional provision rather than understanding their direct access to divine rewards for faithful service. When you combine faith in God's rewarding nature with systematic, wealth-building action, you activate both spiritual and material blessings simultaneously. What reward have you been afraid to expect from God because it seemed too material or worldly? Comment your faith-based expectation below. Genesis 13:2 reveals God's plan for faith-based wealth. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. The Hebrew word kabod means heavy with wealth. Abraham was literally weighed down by his possessions, yet this occurred because of his faith obedience rather than despite it. Abraham's wealth increased proportionally with his faith development, proving that spiritual growth and material abundance complement rather than compete with each other. His riches weren't accidental divine blessing, but predictable result of combining faith with strategic action in business and investment. Napoleon Hill documented this same pattern among successful people who understood that faith attracts opportunities, while action converts opportunities into wealth. Churches present Abraham as humble nomad while suppressing his sophisticated business empire, because wealthy believers threaten institutional financial dependency. The progression is clear. Faith in divine guidance led to strategic decisions that produced extraordinary wealth, which enabled greater kingdom impact than poverty could ever achieve. When you follow Abraham's model of faith-guided wealth creation, you access the same divine favor that made him the father of nations. What strategic action could you take this week that combines faith in God's guidance with practical wealth-building steps? Share your faith action plan below. 2 Chronicles 1:11-12 shows God's delight in faith-wealth combination. Since this is your heart's desire and you have not asked for wealth, possessions or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people. Therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you, and I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor. Solomon asked for wisdom to serve others effectively, yet God gave him both wisdom and unprecedented wealth because he understood that maximum service requires maximum resources. This reveals divine psychology. When your faith motives are pure, God multiplies both spiritual capacity and material capability to maximize your kingdom impact. Napoleon Hill found that the most successful people prioritized service over self-interest, which attracted both personal fulfillment and financial abundance. Churches teach this as choosing between spiritual and material blessings while missing God's intention to provide both when faith priorities are correct. Solomon's wealth enabled him to build the temple, maintain international influence, and create lasting biblical wisdom. Impact impossible without substantial financial resources. What service to others would you provide if you had unlimited financial resources? Comment your faith-motivated wealth vision below. Luke 19:12-26 contains Jesus' most powerful faith-wealth teaching through the parable of the 10 minas. A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return, so he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. "Put this money to work," he said, "until I come back." Jesus explicitly commands wealth multiplication through active investment rather than passive preservation, with the faithful servant who doubled his money receiving praise and additional responsibility. The unfaithful servant who buried his money instead of investing it receives condemnation and loses even what he had. This destroys religious teaching that spiritual people should avoid money multiplication or business success. Napoleon Hill found that successful people understood money as tool for service rather than goal for accumulation, exactly what Jesus teaches through this parable. The phrase, "put this money to work," indicates active wealth creation rather than passive acceptance of current conditions. Churches avoid teaching this parable's wealth principles because it contradicts their anti-prosperity doctrine while proving that Jesus expects believers to multiply resources through faith-guided business activity. What money or resources are you burying instead of putting to work for multiplication? Comment your investment opportunity below. 1 Timothy 6:17-19 reveals the complete faith-wealth system. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Paul assumes believers will be rich in this present world while providing guidance for faithful wealth management, rather than condemning wealth accumulation. The phrase, "richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment," shows God's abundance. Intention includes material pleasure and life enhancement, not just basic survival. This integration of faith priorities with wealth enjoyment creates the balanced approach that maximizes both spiritual development and kingdom impact. Napoleon Hill found that sustainable success requires this balance between accumulation and distribution, self-improvement, and service to others. Churches quote verse 10 about love of money, while suppressing verses 17-19 that provide practical guidance for faithful wealth building and management. When you understand that God wants you rich enough to be genuinely generous while maintaining proper spiritual priorities, you access divine blessing on both faith development and wealth creation. How could being wealthy improve your ability to serve God and others more effectively? Share your faithful wealth management vision below. Deuteronomy 8:18 contains the ultimate faith-wealth promise. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, to confirm His covenant with you. The Hebrew word coach means supernatural power or strength. God literally gives believers wealth-creating abilities as confirmation of His covenant promises. This verse establishes that wealth production is divine gift and covenant confirmation, rather than worldly temptation or spiritual compromise. Faith in God's covenant includes expecting the wealth-creating abilities He promises to provide, while using those abilities confirms your covenant relationship rather than threatening it. Napoleon Hill discovered that successful people recognized higher power working through their abilities. Exactly what this verse describes. They didn't separate business success from spiritual faith, but understood wealth creation as expressing divine gifts for kingdom purposes. Churches suppress this because it eliminates their monopoly on spiritual authority while empowering believers to access divine resources directly through faith-guided action. When you remember that God gives wealth-creating ability as covenant confirmation, you pursue prosperity as spiritual act rather than worldly ambition. What God-given ability do you possess that could produce wealth if you developed it with faith and systematic action? Comment your divine wealth-creating gift below. 2 Corinthians 8:9 reveals the faith-wealth model Jesus established. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor so that you through his poverty might become rich. This verse proves Jesus was originally wealthy in heaven and chose temporary earthly poverty to enable permanent believer prosperity. His sacrifice wasn't to make believers poor, but to make them rich through access to heavenly resources and divine covenant blessings. The Greek word pluteo means to be wealthy, indicating material abundance rather than just spiritual blessing, while grace indicates unmerited favor that includes financial provision. Napoleon Hill found that sustainable wealth requires understanding exchange principles. Jesus exchanged his riches for temporary poverty to enable permanent believer prosperity through covenant access. Churches reverse this message to justify believer poverty, while missing Jesus' intention to transfer his wealth to faithful followers who will use it for kingdom purposes. When you understand that Jesus became poor specifically to make you rich, you receive wealth as inheritance rather than pursue it as ambition. How would you honor Jesus' sacrifice by using wealth he made possible for you to obtain? Comment your wealth stewardship commitment below. Proverbs 10:22 summarizes the faith-wealth equation. The blessing of the Lord brings wealth without painful toil for it. The Hebrew osher means riches and abundance flowing naturally from divine favor rather than human struggle, while without. Painful toil doesn't mean without work, but without the stress and anxiety that comes from operating outside divine principles. Solomon understood that faith alignment with divine principles creates effortless prosperity compared to wealth pursuit through worldly methods that create stress and spiritual compromise. This verse establishes that God's blessing naturally produces wealth when faith and action operate according to divine design. Napoleon Hill called this working smart versus working hard, aligning with universal laws that make success inevitable rather than struggling against them through ignorance or rebellion. Churches avoid teaching this because it threatens their narrative that spiritual people must struggle financially, while proving that faith properly applied creates both material abundance and spiritual peace. When you understand that divine blessing includes automatic wealth creation without painful toil, you pursue prosperity through faith alignment rather than worldly striving. What area of your wealth building currently involves painful toil that could be transformed through better faith alignment? Share your struggle that needs divine ease below. The divine plan integrates faith and wealth through 8 biblical principles that churches systematically suppress. Divine rewards for faith, Hebrews 11:6, wealth as faith result, Genesis 13:2, service-motivated abundance, 2 Chronicles 1:11-12, money multiplication commands, Luke 19:12-26, faithful wealth management, 1 Timothy 6:17-19, divine wealth-creating abilities, Deuteronomy 8:18, inherited prosperity through Jesus, 2 Corinthians 8:9, and blessed abundance without struggle, Proverbs 10:22. This isn't prosperity theology, but biblical financial literacy that reveals God's intention for believers to be both spiritually powerful and materially abundant. Napoleon Hill's research proves these principles work regardless of religious belief, because they're universal laws, but they multiply exponentially when combined with biblical faith and kingdom purposes. Churches suppress this integration because wealthy believers don't need institutional dependency or control. You now understand that faith plus wealth equals divine plan fulfillment rather than spiritual compromise. The only question is whether you'll apply this complete system with the same consistency as successful people throughout history who unconsciously followed these principles. If you're ready to implement the complete Faith Wealth Divine Plan systematically, comment Faith Wealth Activated below, and I'll send you the step-by-step integration guide for combining biblical faith with practical wealth building to fulfill your complete divine potential.